Jake returned home to find his certified beehives under siege by self-appointed HOA enforcers with bolt cutters and bogus authority. At the center was Catherine Trent, a clipboard-wielding compliance officer who thought a neighborhood vote could erase a man's livelihood. But what she didn't know, Jake was the one who licensed every legal hive in the entire county. And wait until you hear how that one detail flipped the whole power game, and why justice this time came with honey. Jake Miller pulled into his driveway just after noon, the back of his pickup still warm from the sun and sticky with the faint scent of wildflower honey. He'd just wrapped up his last delivery at the farmer's market, same as every Saturday. Normally, he'd spend the afternoon checking the brood patterns in his hives or letting neighborhood kids suit up and peek inside a supersedure cell. Instead, he stepped out of the truck and froze. 3 people in neon-reflective vests stood just beyond his backyard fence, gathered near his hives like they'd discovered a hazardous spill site. One of them, a woman in sleek aviator sunglasses and a starched blouse, held a clipboard tight to her chest like it was a badge. The smirk she gave him as she waved him over wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "You, Jake Miller?" she asked, not waiting for a reply. "We're with the HOA's newly formed Environmental Safety Committee, and these—" She motioned to the rows of hives, her nose wrinkling slightly. "These colonies of aggressive stinging insects. Yeah, they're in direct violation of neighborhood code." Jake's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, what?" She flipped through her clipboard theatrically, then pointed to a highlighted section. Article 12, Section 3, noxious activity or materials that may cause discomfort, distress, or danger to other residents. These hives qualify. We've voted. They have to go. Jake stepped closer to the fence, his voice calm but clipped. "These aren't just backyard projects. I'm a registered beekeeper with the state. Every one of those hives is certified, regularly inspected, and I run workshops for the local middle school. This isn't new. These hives have been here for 6 years. You've probably bought honey from them." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Doesn't matter. The committee met last week. Unanimous vote. Consider this official notice." Jake blinked. "You don't even have the authority." That's when the man beside her, tall, with a sunburned neck and a name tag that said Volunteer Enforcer, stepped forward and unzipped a canvas bag. Without a word, he pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. Heavy, shiny, well-oiled. He started walking toward Jake's apiary gate. Jake's heart kicked once in his chest, sharp and sudden. He hadn't thought he'd need to lock the gate. He was wrong. The loud snap of the padlock giving way felt louder than it should have. Jake stood rooted to the ground, a box of market receipts still in his hand, as the metal gate to his apiary swung open like it had never belonged to him at all. The man with the bolt cutters didn't speak. He just handed the broken lock to Catherine Trent like a trophy. She dropped it in a plastic tote and nodded to the third committee member, a nervous-looking teenager in an oversized vest, who began unloading stackable plastic crates onto the grass like they were setting up for a moving job. Except they weren't moving furniture. They were here to dismantle a life. Jake tried to speak, tried again to explain the certifications, the zoning exemptions, the permits, but Catherine cut him off with a polished, practiced tone that sounded like she'd memorized it from a pamphlet. "This property is now subject to provisional remediation under Emergency Nuisance Code subsection B. Unregistered livestock constitutes a wellness hazard and may be subject to seizure." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Bees aren't livestock, and I have every registration." "Not according to our records," she replied crisply. Jake felt his jaw tighten. Their records? What records? The HOA had no jurisdiction over agricultural operations, and certainly not over his bees, which were registered through the state. But there they were, plastic bins clicking open, lids flipped back, bare hands reaching for equipment they clearly didn't understand. It wasn't just arrogant. It was dangerous. And still, Catherine kept her smile. That same smug, empty grin like she was doing him a favor by gutting his livelihood. Across the street, a couple of neighbors had gathered. Some whispered nervously. Others pulled out phones and started recording. A retired couple from next door looked visibly shaken. They all knew Jake. They knew his bees, knew his honey was served at the school breakfast program and stocked at the local co-op. And still, no one stepped in. Jake's hands curled into fists, not out of fear, but out of sheer, restrained fury. This wasn't about wellness or public safety. They didn't even pretend to know what they were doing. They weren't here to protect anyone. They were here to dominate, to prove they could take what they wanted under the thin veil of compliance. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Jake wasn't just some backyard beekeeper with a hobby and a pickup truck. He was the one who wrote the inspection standards for apiary health in the county. The names on every legal beekeeping permit issued within 100 miles, he'd signed them. That night, while Jake stood on his back porch staring at the flattened patch of grass where his hives used to sit, the HOA's Environmental Safety Committee was already patting themselves on the back. On Facebook, no less, a post went up just after 7 p.m. Catherine Trent herself had uploaded the photo. 3 people posing beside Jake's empty apiary, holding plastic crates like trophies. The caption read, "Another code violation neutralized. Community safety first." Jake didn't respond. He didn't comment, didn't share it, didn't rage in the neighborhood group chat like some folks would. Instead, he stepped inside, opened his laptop, and pulled out a worn yellow notebook from the top drawer of his desk. He flipped through the pages, handwritten notes, permit numbers, contact info, and landed on a page marked with a sticky tab labeled, "In case of HOA nonsense." Jake made exactly 3 calls. First, to Don Kessler, the county agricultural commissioner, a man who'd once shadowed Jake on a hive tour and personally thanked him for educating local schools on pollinator health. Second, to Marla Haynes, the regional contact at the Department of Public Health, who coordinated with Jake on environmental safety standards for community gardens. And third, to Deputy Alvarez, the sheriff's office liaison for agricultural disputes. Jake had helped his nephew pass a beekeeping certification exam just last spring. By sunrise, the wheels of real authority were in motion. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up first. Deputy Alvarez didn't ask questions. He issued demands. Catherine, still in her vest, looked up from arranging folders at the HOA office and went pale when the deputy stepped out of the vehicle and cited criminal trespass, unlawful seizure, and destruction of agricultural equipment, all potential violations that carried real consequences. She started to argue, something about community rights and majority votes, but she never got to finish. Because then came the second vehicle, the white county SUV with the agricultural commissioner's office logo on the side. Don Kessler stepped out, silver hair gleaming under his field cap, holding a clipboard of his own. But unlike Catherine's, his clipboard came with power. He walked straight to the center of the HOA office, past the snack table and decorative succulents, and laid out the facts. Jake's hives were certified under California apiary law, specifically protected under Section 29000 of the Food and Agriculture Code. They had been registered, inspected, and approved for public engagement. Their removal without due notice and legal order constituted a violation of state agricultural protections, and possibly even federal pollinator health regulations. Not only was he in the right, Don said, looking Catherine in the eye, but removing those hives was an act of interference with regulated agricultural operations. Catherine tried to respond, but her voice barely made it past her lips. And that's when Jake stepped forward. Quietly, calmly, he opened his laptop and turned the screen toward the room. A PDF document filled the screen, stamped and signed. Jake Miller, county-level apiary, health certifying official. "I don't just follow the bee laws," he said. "I write the inspection protocols you're now in violation of." Silence fell like a stone. Catherine's clipboard dipped. Her smirk was long gone. In a single morning, the balance of power had flipped entirely. What had been a smug campaign to correct Jake's way of life was now an unfolding legal embarrassment for the HOA. Jake didn't shout. He didn't need to. Because now, the rules were his. It took exactly 14 days for the neighborhood newsletter to quietly announce that Catherine Trent had stepped down from her role on the Environmental Safety Committee due to personal reasons. No one was surprised. A few residents even murmured that she'd already boxed up her patio furniture the week before. But what the newsletter didn't mention was the 6-page formal complaint delivered to the HOA board from the county agricultural office, citing unlawful seizure, destruction of protected assets, and procedural overreach. Or the lawsuit filed on Jake's behalf, citing damages not only to personal property, but to an educational public service that benefited the entire community. The HOA's insurance provider took one look at the documented violations, the police report, and the witness statements, and offered a swift settlement. No argument, no appeals, just a wire transfer big enough to make the message loud and clear. You messed with the wrong beekeeper. Jake didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't post about it. He didn't even mention the settlement check to most of his neighbors. He just rebuilt his hives. Not just replaced, rebuilt. Every frame, every foundation, every tool was upgraded. He expanded the pollinator beds, added new protective fencing, and installed a small viewing platform for school field trips. The hives gleamed with fresh cedar boxes and custom-etched brass tags with his name and registration number. But the real payoff came 3 Saturdays later. That morning, the same community clubhouse where the HOA held its compliance meetings was filled to the brim. Not with board members, but with kids in bee antenna headbands, parents sipping coffee, and neighbors who'd quietly cheered Jake on from their porches. Jake stood at the front with a smoker in one hand and a hive frame glistening with capped honey in the other. A hand-painted sign above him read, "Know Your Bee Laws, Free Workshop with Jake Miller." He started by handing out honey sticks to the kids, laughing as they buzzed around in paper wings. Then he walked everyone through the basics of legal beekeeping, pollinator safety, and homeowner rights, quoting the very codes the HOA had pretended to understand. He never once mentioned Catherine by name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew she'd moved out that very morning. And when the laughter died down and the questions were answered, Jake held up a golden frame, thick with honey and sunlight, and delivered the one line that made every parent nod, every teacher smile, and every neighbor feel just a little taller. "You don't mess with someone who licenses every hive in this county," he said, his voice steady, "especially not with bolt cutters and a fake title." The room erupted, not in applause, but in that quiet, shared look people get when justice has finally been served. Jake just smiled, set the frame down, and passed out another round of honey.